Okay. And I'm just going to set this here. Okay, well, I'm very pleased to be here, and every time I come to a meeting with you sorts of folks, I learn a great deal that changes what I do, and so I'm very excited about what I can learn today. And we'll begin by telling you a little bit about what I've been doing and thinking. So this right here is the most advanced learning system that we know to date. And I might add, it's better than anything any of you have ever built. And what I want to talk about today are the dynamics of visual attention and how those dynamics contribute to learning. And although I'm going to be talking about vision, I'm actually not going to be talking much about the eyes. I'm going to be talking a lot about hands and what hands do for vision, at least for toddlers' visual attention, in selecting the objects that they attend to, in stabilizing attention. And I'm going to show, this is quite new work, the role of that in object name learning and also potentially in building object representations. So the bottom line, basically, is that in the toddler, visual attention really is a sensory motor system that involves eyes, head, and hands. Now, all the experiments that I'm going to tell you about today use a new method that we've been working on, and that is using a head camera to capture the dynamics of first-person attention. And before I talk about this, I need to go over a few preliminaries to just set us right. The head camera that we've been using is 70 degrees. In the last experiments I'll tell you about, we've shifted to a 90-degree camera. The toddler visual field, however, is like ours. It's huge, okay? It's about 180 degrees, 170 degrees. So the camera is smaller than the full visual field of information that they're sensitive to. That's not, however, our key problem. The key problem, of course, is that head cameras move with heads, not eyes. So what we want is that case in the middle, right, where the head camera is recording what's ahead, and that's where the eyes are looking at. We don't want those circumstances where the head's looking ahead and the eyes are off over here, which would be the case over there, where there would be a mismatch between what's being recorded on the head camera and what the child is looking at. So I want to do this fast and not go into much detail, and really, if you have questions, you can ask afterwards, but mostly take my word for this. We've done extensive collaboration studies, and extensive cooperation studies to sort of calibrate this device. And the main points here are in red in these calibration studies, that if you're in a constrained geometric setting, in our case it's a tabletop play with a near geometry, and if the toddler is actively engaged in reaching and playing, that is not just sitting back and watching like a puppet show, but actively engaged in reaching and playing, then there is strong coupling of the head and eye movements. In these calibration experiments, we independently measured head direction and eye gaze direction. And there is an 87% concordance rate. The eyes do lead the head. So if they're going to shift attention, the eyes do lead the head by about a half a second, but the head rapidly comes into alignment. So the big point is that for toddlers manually playing with objects, the head camera provides a good first approximation of the first-person view. The other point I've got to make, because people get very confused about this is not eye tracking, okay? The goal in these experiments is not to track moment-to-moment focuses of attention within the visual field. The goal of these experiments is to measure, to capture moment-to-moment what's in view, what's available in the field as a whole, okay? So this is not eye tracking, and that's not our question. We want to know how the information available in the view, in the visual field, changes as a consequence of the child's own movements and actions. All right, so to begin. Toddler learning takes place in the real world, which is highly cluttered with lots of information, lots of objects, lots of shifts in attention. Learning in that cluttered real-world environment is going to require attention. It's going to require the selection of relevant sources of information, the filtering out of other sources of information, sustaining and stabilizing attention long enough to do any learning on some portions of that information, and also disengaging attention when it's appropriate and shifting to something else. And what we wanted to do with the head camera was try to capture how toddlers, what learning in the cluttered world is like for toddlers, what the challenges are and what the solutions are. And as our first effort to do this, we developed an in-lab procedure that mimics, although simplifies, some of the complexity of real-world learning. We're going to look at tabletop play with toys with a social partner. There are multiple toys on the table at any one time, so more than one potential target of attention. And since it's naturalistic, semi-naturalistic, since they're all wired up, semi-naturalistic interaction of play, there'll be many shifts of intention, a lot of complexity in the dynamics and what happens next, what one might be looking at, what one might be doing, okay? In these experiments, we have tended to put head cameras on both the toddler and the parent. We're really interested in the toddler, but the parent, putting on the parent provides some useful comparisons for thinking about how the toddler is different. Some of you might be interested in how we get head cameras on toddlers. It's the very same procedure that is used, in fact, if you're going to be doing EEG recordings. You distract them with this highly technical piece of equipment right here of pushing buttons that causes toys to pop up, and then you get the head camera on in one very fast move while they're distracted, and you adjust it slowly, making sure that when they're pushing a button, the button being pushed is in the center of the head camera while they're engaged in that toy, okay? Now, before I tell you about the experiments, I'm going to let you watch because it'll make it a lot more straightforward in talking about what the data look like. Okay, the view on that side showing the parent, that is from the child's head camera. The view on that side is from the parent's head camera. These are exactly identical head cameras, by the way. They're identical, okay, on the parent and on the child. Okay, so where do we go here? All right, here we go. No, what's happening? Okay, let's try this again. All right, one more time. Let's try this one. Okay, that's basically what they look like. All right, so in the first experiment I'll tell you about, we recorded 6 minutes from each dyad. We actually have the camera on the mom's head, the camera on the child's head, and an overhead bird's eye camera. So we get about 190,000 image frames from each dyad, and we have 10 dyads. In the beginning experiments, we didn't know how much the geometry mattered, and so we have Half the subjects, the mom was sitting on the floor, so her head was approximately equal distance from the tabletop. The other half, the mother was sitting in a chair, so her head was above the tabletop by more than the child. It makes absolutely no difference, and so I'm not even going to talk about that. All right, what we use with this massive amount of data is automatic image analysis. As you might have noticed, we have an all-white room, and everybody's wearing white, and we have simple objects of different colors. That enables us to automatically recognize the objects in each camera view and on the tabletop, so there's no hand coding. And the main data that I'm going to tell you about are in red. They concern what objects and what body parts are in view in these cameras, and what their size is in the view at any moment. Right here is the main result, and I'm going to show you. This is one dyad playing 500 frames. And so on your right is the parent's view. On the y-axis is the size of the three objects on the table, the orange object, the green object, the blue object, and the yellow indicates the total size of all body parts lumped together, okay? Everybody's face and hands lumped together. And if you just look at the mom's view on the right, it's a very stable view. Everything's always in view. It's a very distant view, okay? All the individual objects and body parts take up a constant and relatively small and equal portion of the view. The child's view on the left there is completely different, okay? It's a view in which objects go in and out of view, where there often is one dominating object or body part in view at any moment in time, okay? Much more dynamic. Object sizes are much closer. And so I'll show you, this is now across all the dyads in these aspects of results across all the dyads. So the one major point of what we see in the child's head camera view is that the child's view of object is closer and bigger. On the top, so you get some sense, this is with the 70-degree camera. The largest object in the 37% is 37% of the head camera image. The pepper in the middle is 23%, and the pepper on the end is 14%, okay? What's shown below is the proportion of head camera frames in which the size of all the objects, not just the larger objects, takes up between 0 to 10% of the head camera image, 11 to 20% of the head camera image, and so forth. And what I want you to see is that for the parent head camera image, that's light gray, in over 60% of the frames, the total size of the objects is less than 10%. For the child's head camera, over 60%, so that's that. For the child's head camera, over 60% of the images are larger than 10%, okay, of the objects. Okay. This figure shows the proportion of head camera frames in which the image size of the largest object, what percentage the image size of the largest object was to all the other objects. And the point of this is to show you that often for the child, one object dominates. So down there where it says, it's supposed to say 33% to 40%, that's when the largest object is roughly equal to the other two objects in view, because there's three objects potentially, okay? But what you should see is that for many of the image frames for the child, the largest object in the frame is bigger than twice, okay, the size of the other objects that are present. Okay? The biggest objects is 2 times the size of the other objects present. And on that last one at the end, where it says 100%, those 30% of the trials in which the largest object is 100% means it's the only object in view. So often for the child, one object is dominating in terms of being bigger in size than all the other objects that could be in view, and often there's only one object in view, okay? I'm going to define for much of the rest of the talk a dominating object. We're going to use this in a number of our measures. When I say dominating object, I mean an object that is 2 times the sum of all the other in-view objects, okay? All right. So, in the child's view, often one object dominates. And the other point that I want to make here is this one dominating object at a time is not an artifact of the head camera or the geometry of tabletop play. And I can make this transparently clear to you by just going back to that first calibration study that I did that Hanako Yoshida and I did using the head camera. In that first calibration study, we just put the camera on the child. We didn't put it on the parent. But what I want you to see here, this is, a third-person view and the child's head camera view. When the child is sitting back, okay, the child can see everything on the table, okay, all the objects, okay. But this kind of an image from the child's head camera is not the kind of image we get hardly ever. We usually get images like this, okay. That is, the fact that you're only seeing one object at a time is not because they couldn't, if they just sat back and looked, see everything, okay? It's because they don't, okay? And in that first calibration study, we actually independently coded what was in the child's head camera image, in view, the number of objects, in view in the child's head camera image, and the number of objects in view in the third-person camera, asking how many of the toys in the tabletop were in view. This was free play, so parents could put on as many objects as they wanted. Each one of these figures shows one dyad, with the dotted line being the actual number of objects on the table at any point in time as they were playing. And the black line shows the number of objects in view in the child's head camera. Okay. And as you can see, there is a serious reduction in the available information. Okay. So, a serious reduction in the information in view. And that reduction actually is due mostly to what the hands are doing. Okay. So, everything I'm going to tell you next is actually obvious right here in this picture. There's one object in view because these children pick up objects and bring them close to the face. And when they bring them close to the face, they're blocking everything but the object they're attending to, okay? That's basically the main result. But we actually went forward and did another study to look more closely at selection through the hands. These data are with a totally new sample of dyads roughly the same age. And in these studies, once again, one object often dominated the child's view. This figure here just shows the proportion of frames in which the dominating object, that is 2 times greater than the sum of the other present objects, took up 3%, 5%, or 10% of the head camera field for the child. And it really just replicates the previous results that I've told you. What we really wanted to ask in this experiment was bigger means closer. But who does the selection? Okay. We have child head camera images that are like this, where the parent is pushing the object forward. And we have head camera images like the one with the pepper, where the child's hand's on the object. So what we did is we hand-coded all the videos and asked, when there was a dominating object, who was holding it. And these figures make the point quite clear that it's the child who's holding it. So the top one shows the proportion of frames in which the dominating object, that's 2 times the size of everything else, of all of their objects, and also 10% size, actual size, in the head camera image, was in the child's hand versus the parent's hand, that's blue. And the bottom shows the same figure where we've now just lessened the threshold for what counts as a dominating object. And in both cases, when there is one big object in the field, in the child's head camera image, that object is in the child's hand most of the time. And overall, if you just ask across both of these thresholds, when there is a dominating object in the child head camera image, 20% of the time, there are cases like here where the parent is pushing it forward, and 64% there are cases in which the child is holding it in their hand. You can also ask the question, however, of who instigated it. Maybe that 64% over there arises because the mother hands the object to the child. So you can ask the question, who's doing the selecting? Okay. So the next thing we asked in these data is what is happening right before this moment? Who's doing the selecting? Who's holding an object just before it becomes dominant? Okay. So what I'm going to show you next are going to define a point in which objects that are going to become dominant are in the child's hands. I don't know what this is from. We'll just leave that. All right. So here's the thing. On the y-axis is the proportion of time. Okay, so up here it's 0 on the first figure. That's when the object is just grabbed by the child. Prior to that, the object's not in the child's hand. The object is not dominating, but we're asking in whose hand it is. So 0 is the point at which the object first becomes dominant. And what I want you to be able to see, when it reaches so 0 is the point at which it passes the threshold for being dominant. And what you can see is just prior to being dominant, the object is in the child's hand. It's not in the parent's hand prior to becoming visually dominant in the field. Over here, 0 defines the moment at which the object stops passing the threshold for being dominant, that is, stops passing the threshold for being the largest in the child's visual field. And as you can see, when it stops being dominant, it's also in the child's hand. The point I really want to make from this is that it is the toddler's hand actions, okay? It's not the parents. It's not the parents pushing objects towards these kids that are strongly determining the one-at-a-time character of the toddler's views, okay? It's the child's own hand actions. So the whole reason we have this, okay, the whole reason babies have this, toddlers have this, actually is because they have short arms, okay? They have a small visual motor workspace. That means whenever they have active interest in anything, they're going to bring the object close. Bringing the object close, naturally by the geometry of the situation, blocks the view of other objects, okay? It's a very nice physical external selection method, okay? So, short arms and bringing objects close enables a child, just through their natural play and physical interaction with the world, to select relevant sources of information and to filter other sources of information out. That's what I've just told you. What I want to tell you next is how also these processes, the sensory motor system, may conspire in important ways to sustain and stabilize attention. So these are data that we've just finished collecting. Again, we have 10 dyads, same age. This time, we're using a 90-degree camera, so the visual field is a little bigger, more of the periphery. We also are using motion sensors to capture head movements, and we're going to analyze the head camera images by using bottom-up salience maps, which provide some very interesting information. So from putting the motion sensors on the heads, it's obvious just from watching these kids, that they move a whole lot more than do parents. There is much more head movement, particularly in head orientation, okay? Which means they have much more dynamic views. That's first little fact need to know. Okay. The next thing I need to tell you before we look at the more interesting part of the data is what we did is we took the head camera images and we just used a bottom-up salience map to ask what is in these images. And I want to make the point here that I'm not proposing that this bottom-up salience map is actually the correct psychological model of these babies, of visual salience for these children. All I want to do is measure what the information is in the field. I'm just using it as a measurement, not claiming it as a psychological model, okay? All right. So basically what we do is we have our 3 camera images. We have the babies, the mothers, and the bird's eye view from overhead. We measure the, by the EUCogII system here, we just measure the motion salience, the orientation salience, and the dynamic salience for each frame. Okay. And then we can take the time series and look at the interrelationship between object size, object location, the motion saliency, the intensity saliency, and so forth. And I'll get to that in a minute. But the first result I want to first show you is just the relative salience using the salience maps as well as the size of each object. So what I'm going to do in the next figure is I'm going to show you the relative salience of objects in the child's view, and the measure of relative salience is really the size of each object in the salience map, okay? So for motion salience and intensity salience, what this shows is the percentage in terms of the percentage of the head camera field, of the saliency field that's occupied by objects that are in the child's hand, that's blue, and objects that are not in the child's hand. And further over is just the other measure that we've used, which is the size of the object in the child's hand and not in the child's hand in the field. And what you can see is that held objects, objects being held by the child are visually more salient. They're more salient in terms of their motion, they're more salient in terms of their intensity, and they're more salient in terms of their size in the field, okay? So this brings us to what we really want to do, which is to try to look at the perception action loop. We know from what I've told you so far that hands are selecting objects. And we also know from what I've just told you that doing so actually adds properties to what's in the visual field that makes those objects, the ones being held, more salient, and that these might play a role in sustaining attention. You grab the object, it becomes bigger, more salient, that makes you continue to attend it, grab it, and hold it, okay? So what I want to do next to make this point is I'm going to tell you the events that lead up to a child grabbing hold of an object, and then to what happens to the visual field or the head camera field when the child is holding an object. So first, the events leading up to holding an object, okay? All right, so these are brand new data and the first time I've talked about them, so we'll have to see how well I do here. 0 defines a frame in which the hand first comes into contact with the object. So 10 frames back, 1 second back, 2 seconds back, 3 seconds back, those are all times when the child is not holding the object that they're going to hold. And what I'm showing here is the amount of, on the y-axis, the amount of head movement. And what we did to first look at these data is just make a model, a threshold model that was defining there either being movement or no movement. So blue is no movement at all by this threshold model. The orange is orientation motion, the green is position motion, and the purple is both. And really what I want you to see here is that, you know, lots of things are happening, but a full second out before the child grabs the object, okay? There are large head movements, okay? Actually, mostly in position and orientation together, okay? Position and orientation. That's an error in the orientation, okay? So a full second out, the head begins to move, large position movements, okay? This shows what's happening to object size in the head camera image at the top. And what's happening is that head begins to move as the object is getting bigger. Literally, what they're doing is moving towards the object, okay? It's getting bigger in the head camera image. Also, what's happening is they are centering that object in the head camera image. So the bottom shows the distance of the object to the center of the head camera field. So what's happening just prior to grasping the object is big movements of the head, bringing the head closer to the object and centering that object in the visual field, okay? That's what an intention to grasp is doing, okay? And this is what I think may be the most enticing result for future work. What I'm showing here is a measure of the motion saliency, the size, and the degree to which the object is centered, okay? How much that is changing, becoming more salient in terms of motion salience, more salient in terms of being bigger in the head camera image, and more centered in the head camera image as a function of just before holding the object, that's the pink part, while the child is holding the object, that's the blue part. Children hold it for different amounts of time, so I'm going 2 seconds just after holding it and 1 second before letting it go, and the green is letting it go. And really, again, these are brand new results, but the main fact here is that when the child is holding the object, okay, the contents of the head camera image are highly stabilized, okay? High motion salience that remains, okay? Because holding the object and whatever the little hand movements are involved, but they're centering that on the head, keeping the object in the center of the visual field and keeping the size of it large, okay? Holding an object is stabilizing attention and keeping the object salient. So I think what this suggests to us is that in the toddler, visual attention really is a sensory motor system that involves the head and hands. And of course, what we need to do next is do a lot more work in figuring out those dynamics and how it is maintaining that attention. But what I want to go to next, in the very last part of the talk here, is what this might be good for. This graph here, where you've got one object selected in view and stabilized in the visual field, would seem like it would be the optimal time for learning. Holding an object for toddlers ought to be when they're most learning about objects. So, in work that is ongoing now, that is what we're asking. We're asking, what is all this good for? And the idea is that it might be good for object name learning and also for building the representations for visual object recognition. So what we did in this experiment is, in terms of asking what it is good for, we had the basic same paradigm that we had before, only now we had novel objects, and the mom was trained prior to the experiment in the names of these objects. She was told to just play with the child in a naturalistic way. She was not told to teach the child the names of these objects, just to play with the child, but if she ever named them, to name them by these names, okay? At the end of the experiment, we tested the child's learning. Now, the point here is not that children should be doing a lot of learning. We don't expect them to learn the 9 object names that are presented in this experiment. But the question was, if they did learn anything, what made that learning happen? What was in the child's view and what behavior on their part or on the parent's part predicted learning? We tested learning in a standard technique that we developmental psychologists use. We put the 2 objects out, greater than 18 inches apart, and we ask, where is the doma? Look at the doma, and we just measure where the child looks. And then what we did is we took for each child, the children were tested on each object twice. We considered them to have learned the name of the object if they got 2 out of 2 correct by our testing measure. And so then we could just, for each child, bundle together all the objects that, by our criterion, we said the child had learned, and all the objects that the child had not learned. All the ones bundled together that the child had learned, we would assume were somehow successful naming events whenever they were named during the course of play. And the ones they didn't learn, we would assume were unsuccessful naming events. And then what we want to know is what's happening in those successful naming events. And we're still working on these data, but what I want to tell you is the best predictors of whether a child learned an object name in this free play was whether it was in the child's hands when it was named, and whether it was dominating, that is 2 times the size of every other object, in the child's visual field when it was named. Okay. What was happening in the parent's field is not a very good predictor. The number of times that an object was named was not a good predictor. Parents could have named an object 10 times in the course of play, but if they didn't name it at the right moments, when it was in the child's hands, when it was big in the child's field, then it didn't matter, okay? This suggests that the key thing on learning might not be number of trials, but doing it at the right moment in time, when attention is on that object and when it's sustained and stabilized. The next domain that we are looking at to try to ask what is this good for is visual object recognition. So here we're trying to ask what happens as the child holds and manipulates an object close to the body. It seems like a number of good things might happen. As you hold this object and manipulate it and play with it, you are in time seeing multiple views and sides of that object. This seems to be perhaps ideal for dynamically integrating the multiple views of an object and coming up with a whole object representation. And so in one completed study on this, we have looked at how children manually and visually explore objects. Here we just give them one object at a time to hold, and we ask what views they present themselves. Okay. The subjects in this are 12 to 36-month-olds. We've used a whole bunch of kinds of objects, both novels, both known objects and somewhat novel. Doesn't make a big difference. And what we do is we take the head camera images, and we're going to, we have this custom coding thing we developed where we can manipulate a 3D representation of the object to match the one in the head camera field, so we can get the XYZ coordinates, so we know exactly what orientation the child is showing to themselves. And then the data that I'm going to show you today derive from what we call a dwell time map. What we're going to do is you can take this object here, and you can think of it as being in a sphere, and then you can lay that sphere out and make a 2-dimensional map. And the maps I'm going to show you are like this, and we're going to show how long as they visually explored an object they were at particular viewpoints. And in terms of the representations, okay, there's a couple things to note, is the top shows the object held upright to gravity. The bottom shows the objects upside down, okay? So if they've got the object oriented appropriately for gravity, all the activation should be on the top. The other thing we're particularly interested in is what are called planar views. Those are where you have the views of the side of the object, the geometric side of the object, not a 3/4 view, okay? And so that's how we do that. So this, for example, is a dwell time map for children under 24 months of age. It's again just to orient you before you see the real ones. So this is a real one, but the bright yellow spots are high dwell point times where the child has looked at the planar views of the choo-choo train, okay? And you can see the dark red where it's smearing across objects held in a particular orientation and then rotated, okay? And the bottom, the object would be upside down. Okay, so now I'm going to show you what adults in this procedure. We give the little objects to adults, they have the head camera on, do it just like children. This is what adult view maps look like. The dark is where they're dwelling more, okay? What adults do is they dwell around the planar views of objects in dynamic viewing. There's a lot of information around the planar views. If you just deviate plus or minus 5 degrees, you get a whole nother view of the object, new information. So they're dwelling around the planar views. They're tending to rotate the objects around one axis. That's where you get it smeared here. The axis is usually they hold the object with respect to gravity, whatever is sort of the appropriate canonical way you would hold the object, and then look around it. And there's nothing on the bottom. They're not holding these objects upside down. Both novel objects and real objects, they have some kind of canonical definition of where it sits relative to gravity, and that's how they explore it, okay? So those are adults, an already developed system. If you look at 12-month-olds, they're the top. It is one big smear, mostly, okay? There's no upright and no upside down. They are mostly, however, focusing, you can see the little dark spots, they, like adults, are dwelling around the planar views, okay? So the geometric structure of the objects is mattering. If you go down to 18 months old, they actually are dwelling a little more, if you do the statistics, around the planar views, but there's still no upside down, upside right, and it's still pretty smeary. When you start getting to 23 and 30 months, they don't look like adults exactly, but they're getting very, very close, okay? There is a lot of dwell time around the planar views, and there's a strong bias for geometric upright in all these objects, okay? So here's the question we want to ask next, and I wish that this were a year from now so I could say more. But one real possibility is that children are discovering the geometric structure of objects through their own actions on them, that by holding them close and playing with them, by rotating those views, that they are actually building three-dimensional representations of the geometric structure of objects. And what's interesting about this is a bias to be at planar views is going to influence those objects you see, is going to influence the representations you build in your head of object structure. Those representations in object structure, of course, are also going to guide how you select the information that you show yourself about objects, and you really can have a developing system that is going to push itself along in terms of building object representations. Okay. So the suggestion here is for visual object recognition that holding objects is going to allow for the dynamic integration of views. There's also the possibility that how our hands best grasp holdable objects may encourage attention to particular kinds of geometric structure, and this might actually be the origin of the kinds of geometric representations that we as adults have of three-dimensional objects. Next steps that we're beginning to do now is to look at the relationship of this to view-independent object recognition in children, and those results are encouraging but not in, okay? So to conclude, the points that I wanted to make today is that this, so I think we would all agree, is the most advanced learning system known. Is also a learning system that creates her own learning experiences by how she moves, by what she holds, that the dynamics of those sensory experiences as they actually happen in real time are in fact the stuff out of which intelligence is made. And I've given you some hints that it's going to matter greatly for things like learning object names, and I think also greatly for visual object recognition. And it's also a reminder that vision isn't just about the eyes, that vision is, in human beings at least, a dynamic system of eyes, head, and hands. And now I'd like to thank my collaborators, Chen Yu, who is really instrumental on all of this, does all the hard work, and Alfredo Pereira, who's my postdoc and does all the real work, okay? And then Shar Wozniak and Hanako Yoshida. And of course, we also need to thank our funders. Okay, thank you.